She watched Frank's eyes, blank and unblinking, as the teacup shattered against the kitchen wall beside his head. Sarah and Mike, her children, stood frozen by the doorway, their faces pale. He simply looked at the ceramic shards, then back at her, a quiet disappointment settling on his features. "Is that all you've got?" he asked, his voice flat. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the linoleum floor of the kitchen. Carol sat at the oak table tracing patterns on the chipped formica, while her daughter, Sarah, 20 years old and already too sensible, poured herself another glass of iced tea. Mike, just 18, leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretching under the table, scrolling quietly through his phone. The familiar hum of the refrigerator filled the space, a dull comfort she had grown to resent. "It's just predictable," Carol finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded thin, almost a whisper, but the words carried weight. She glanced at Sarah, then at Mike, hoping for some flicker of understanding. "Every day is the same. Frank comes home, eats dinner, watches TV. He agrees with everything I say." She sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that felt heavy in the quiet room. "He's too malleable." Sarah put down her glass with a soft clink. She looked at her mother, her brow furrowed. "Mommy, why are you complaining about Daddy? He's a good man. He works hard. He never yells." Her voice had an edge of accusation. "You're acting like a spoiled teenager." Carol flinched, but the truth of Sarah's words didn't quite land. She pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "It's not about yelling, Sarah. It's about passion, about life. Sometimes I just want a little variety. I want him to show some backbone, to get angry even." She looked away out the window at the neatly trimmed lawn. The perfect, predictable lawn. Mike lowered his phone, his eyes wide. He shuddered visibly, pulling his shoulders up around his ears. "Really? My father has gotten angry with me before, and I wouldn't want to repeat the experience." He spoke softly, his voice laced with a memory Carol couldn't quite decipher, a fear that felt out of place with Frank's usual quiet demeanor. "It's not like other people getting mad." Carol waved a dismissive hand. "That's different. That was about you not cleaning your room or that time you dented the car. This is about us. Our marriage." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, though the only other people in the house were her own children. "I have a plan. I will stab, push, and abuse your father until he loses his patience and gets angry with me." The words hung in the air, sharp and unbelievable. She saw Sarah's jaw drop, Mike's hand slowly returning to his phone, but not engaging with it. "But to do that, I need your help." Sarah found her voice first, a little shaky. "Mommy, if you love Daddy, you wouldn't put him through that kind of ordeal. That's not love. That's cruel." Her eyes searched Carol's, trying to find the sense in her mother's pronouncement. Mike, however, was firm. He shook his head, pushing himself away from the table. "No, no, no, I'll have no part in this." He stood, his height suddenly asserting itself, making him seem older than his 18 years. "You don't know what you're talking about. The problem with Dad is that you don't get a warning before he hits his limit. He just snaps." The word snaps resonated, a chilling echo in the quiet kitchen. Carol tried to soften her proposal to make it sound less drastic. "I won't take Frank to the extreme, Mike. I just need him to stand up to me, to care enough to fight back." She looked from her son's worried face to her daughter's stunned expression. "It's for his own good, in a way, to make him feel something." Sarah remained skeptical, but a tiny flicker of her mother's stubbornness seemed to catch. "Okay, Mommy," she said slowly, picking her words carefully. "Up to a point, but if things go sideways, I'm going to support Daddy. You understand?" It wasn't a full agreement, but it was enough for Carol to feel a crack in their united front. Mike was not swayed. He pushed his chair back into the table with a scrape of wood on linoleum. "Absolutely not. I won't watch you hurt him. If I see my father suffering, I'll tell him everything." His voice was steady, a clear, unmistakable warning. Carol, however, heard only what she wanted to hear. Mike's stern words were merely background noise against the symphony of her own intentions. The destructive seed of her plan was firmly planted, ready to sprout in the quiet house. The tension in the quiet Midwestern kitchen hung heavy and unspoken, a silent promise of the storm to come. Frank remained completely oblivious, likely somewhere in his workshop, whistling a tune Carol hadn't heard in years. The next morning, the campaign began not with a bang, but with a sharp, insistent demand that cut through the early quiet of the kitchen. Frank was already at the stove, the aroma of brewing coffee just starting to fill the air, when Carol's voice sliced through the stillness from the living room. Frank, where's my coffee? I told you I wanted coffee." Her tone was strident, not a request but an accusation, as if he had deliberately withheld something from her. Frank paused, the coffee scoop halfway to the filter. He blinked, a faint furrow appearing between his brows. He was used to Carol's moods, but this was different, a deliberate sharpness that felt out of place so early in the day. He finished preparing the brew, poured a cup, and carried it silently into the living room, where Carol was already settled on the sofa, a magazine open on her lap. He extended the cup, his hand steady. He tried to walk away, to retreat to the sanctuary of the newspaper at the kitchen table. "Well, what? What took you so long?" Carol didn't even look up from her magazine. Her words clipped and cold. "I'm not a coffee maker, you know, freshly made coffee that takes time." Her voice rose slightly, the indignation manufactured. Frank stopped, turning back slowly. "Don't talk to me like that, Carol," he started, his voice quiet, almost pleading. He wanted to understand, to ask what was wrong, but Carol cut him off, her voice overlapping his, louder, firmer. "What? Are you deaf now? I just asked a question. It's not a big deal. Just get it right next time." Over the following days, the subtle abuse continued, a steady drip against the stone of Frank's patience. It was in the way Carol would leave her clothes on the floor for him to pick up, directly in his path. It was in the way she would contradict him in front of the children, about trivial things but with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, Frank, you always exaggerate. It wasn't like that at all." It was in the way she'd complain about his cooking, his choice of TV show, the way he breathed. Each instance was small, insignificant on its own, but together they formed a persistent, irritating current, slowly draining him. He started looking thinner, his shoulders a little more slumped. The quiet lines around his eyes seemed to deepen. Mike noticed first. His father would come home from work, sit down at the table, and just stare at his untouched plate for a long time before picking up his fork. One evening, after Carol had gone out with her bridge club, leaving Frank to watch reruns of an old Western, Mike approached him cautiously. "Dad, are you okay? You seem tired." Frank looked up from the television, his eyes a little vacant. He managed a small, tired smile. "I'm fine, son. Just a little weariness." He paused, then added, "It's only about Carol and myself, you know. Something I can sort out." His voice was calm, almost reassuring, but Mike could see the effort it took. Frank, ever the peacekeeper, truly believed he could sort it out. He had always been the one to smooth things over, to absorb the small shocks of daily life. He genuinely thought that if he just remained calm, if he just gave Carol enough space, she would come around. He underestimated the depth of Carol's malicious intentions, the calculated nature of her provocations. He mistook her deliberate cruelty for a passing phase, a frustrated outburst that would eventually fade. The family dynamic shifted dramatically. An unspoken strain now stretched across the rooms, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Sarah would rush through dinner, finding excuses to leave the table, avoiding her mother's sharp comments and her father's quiet endurance. Mike would linger, watching his father with a growing, palpable worry. He saw his father's spirit wane, saw the quiet strength that usually anchored Frank beginning to fray at the edges. Carol observed Frank closely, her eyes sharp. She was looking for signs of anger, a spark, any reaction that would confirm her plan was working. But she found only quiet resignation, a deepening of his stoicism. He simply absorbed her jabs, deflecting them with silence, or a mild, almost apologetic response. It wasn't what she wanted. It wasn't the fiery outburst she believed would reignite their marriage. Sarah was caught in the middle, torn between her mother's erratic demands and her father's quiet suffering. She tried to intervene once or twice with soft, "Mom, don't you think that's a bit much?" only to be met with a withering look from Carol that silenced her immediately. She started spending more time in her room, the sounds of her parents' subtle conflict filtering up through the floorboards. The house, once a sanctuary of routine and comfortable habit, slowly transformed into a place of subtle, insidious conflict. The air grew heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of Carol's manufactured grievances and Frank's patient bewilderment. Frank began to spend more time alone, retreating to his workshop in the basement, the faint whir of a sanding machine providing a dull counterpoint to Carol's ceaseless provocations upstairs. He sought solace in solitude, in the predictable rhythm of shaping wood, away from the unpredictable, corrosive atmosphere that had settled over their home. The family car and caravan hurtled south on the highway, a metal shell of carefully contained tension. The landscape outside, flat and endless, offered no distraction from the palpable strain within. Frank gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The morning, before they had even pulled out of the driveway, had already cemented itself in his mind as one of the worst days of his life. Carol's hostility had been relentless, starting from the moment he tried to pack the last of the breakfast dishes. Her actions during the caravan loading had deteriorated from mere criticism to outright humiliation. She had deliberately tripped him as he carried a box of supplies, causing a minor spill of canned goods. Then, as he tried to secure the awning, she stood arms crossed, loudly ridiculing his technique in front of their neighbors, who were out watering their lawns. Frank had nearly snapped then, a hot, unfamiliar rage bubbling up in his chest. But he swallowed it down as he always did, focusing now solely on the steady rhythm of the road, struggling to contain the simmering anger that threatened to boil over. Carol, perhaps sensing the thinness of his patience, was uncharacteristically quiet in the passenger seat. She usually offered a running commentary on his driving. Too fast, too slow, too close to the line. Today, she just stared out the window, a strange, knowing smirk playing on her lips. She understood, in her twisted way, that Frank was almost at his limit. She wanted to push him, but she also knew the exact pressure points, the precarious balance. After a grueling 3-hour drive, marked only by the drone of the engine and the children's hushed whispers in the back, they pulled into a state park campsite. The setup of the caravan was a familiar ritual, years of shared experience making the process almost silent. Frank, Sarah, and Mike moved with practiced efficiency, erecting the awning, unhitching the trailer, connecting the utilities. Carol watched from a picnic table, sipping a sparkling water, offering no help, no comments. For once, she found nothing to reproach Frank about. It was a rare and unsettling moment of quiet, the kind that often preceded a storm. They ate lunch in silence, the clink of forks against plates the only sound. As soon as the last sandwich was consumed, Frank stood. "I'm going for a walk," he announced, his voice flat. He needed to unwind, to regain his composure before the anger, still coiled tight in his gut, could truly take hold. He walked for nearly 3 hours, following a winding trail through sparse woods, listening to the rustle of dry leaves and the chirping of crickets. The steady exertion, the isolation, slowly bled the tension from his shoulders. When he returned to the caravan, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, he felt refreshed, his mood considerably improved. He expected to find Carol inside, perhaps reading or setting up for dinner. The caravan was empty. He checked the picnic table, then the small communal bathroom block. Nothing. A faint sense of unease settled in his chest. He scanned the campsite, a scattering of RVs and tents nestled among the trees. At the far end, near the edge of a small clearing, he spotted her. Carol was seated at a picnic table with a group of other campers he didn't recognize, laughing, a glass of wine in her hand. He approached, his steps careful on the gravel, a tentative smile on his face. He kept his voice soft, an attempt to bridge the distance, to invite her back into their shared space. "Darling, shall we go to dinner?" Carol looked up, her eyes narrowing as they met his. Her smile, which had been warm and open with the strangers, vanished instantly. Her voice, when she spoke, was dismissive and cold, cutting him off before he could even register the shift. "Can't you see I'm in fun company? So if you would be so kind as to back off." Her words were sharp, public, meant to belittle. The other campers, 2 men and a woman, exchanged smirks, their eyes flicking from Carol to Frank, then back again. Frank's face went white as a sheet. His blood ran cold. The insult, delivered so casually, so cruelly in front of strangers, was a physical blow. He stood frozen, the noise of the campsite fading, his ears ringing with her contempt. Then, to his utter disbelief, Carol turned her attention back to the group, her hand casually, almost suggestively, coming to rest on one of the men's thighs. It was a fleeting gesture, but deliberate, a silent message of exclusion and betrayal. Frank watched, stunned, the air knocked out of him. The unspoken challenge, the public shaming, the blatant disregard for their marriage, it all coalesced into a sharp, painful clarity. He found his voice, a low, guttural murmur that was barely audible even to himself. "As you wish, madam." The words felt bitter on his tongue, the taste of ashes. He turned, his back ramrod straight, and walked slowly back to the caravan, leaving her there with her fun company. With each step, a final decision solidified in his mind. The quiet patience, the desire to sort it out, had evaporated. He realized with stark clarity that he had had enough. Back in the caravan, the small space felt suddenly cavernous, filled with the echo of Carol's cruel dismissal. The air, thick with the smell of stale coffee and sun-baked plastic, seemed to press in on Frank. He sat at the small dinette table, his hands folded, staring at the scarred tabletop. The decision, stark and cold, had settled in his mind. Tomorrow he would meet Carol and leave her. There was no going back, no sorting it out this time. The line had been crossed, irrevocably. He immediately began his preparations, moving with a quiet, almost surgical precision. He pulled out his wallet, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and his car keys, their metal cool against his palm. The caravan was quiet, the children asleep in their bunks, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in their parents' lives. He slipped out of his caravan and into the darkness, the gravel crunching softly under his worn sneakers. He drove to the nearest village, a small cluster of lights barely visible from the campsite. The ATM at the gas station was dimly lit, casting his reflection, gaunt and determined, in the screen. He withdrew as much money as possible from his savings account, the machine whirring with an almost conspiratorial hum. He repeated the process with his credit card, draining it, leaving nothing behind for Carol to access. Each transaction was a deliberate severance, a quiet act of defiance. The small village offered little else, but Frank remembered seeing a bank branch earlier in the day. He found it, a sturdy brick building, closed for the night. He knew he couldn't open an account now, but he wanted to scout it out. He planned to be there first thing in the morning. He would open a new separate account in his name, a clean slate, a financial barrier between his past and whatever came next. Returning to the caravan, the digital clock on the dashboard read 10:47 p.m. He pulled out his cell phone, its screen a bright beacon in the dark interior of the car, and called his boss. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Frank, everything all right?" "No, not exactly, David," Frank said, keeping his voice low, his eyes scanning the campsite for any movement. He chose his words carefully, explaining the grave situation in broad strokes, without going into the specifics of Carol's public humiliation or the other man's thigh. "Something's come up. I need some time. An extended leave." David, a good man who had known Frank for years, listened patiently. "Of course, Frank. Take what you need. You can take your entire vacation if you need to." Almost 3 months. He paused, a genuine note of concern entering his voice. "And if things are still unresolved, we can talk about compassionate leave. Just focus on yourself right now." Frank felt a flicker of warmth, a small comfort in the desolate landscape of his impending separation. "Thank you, David. I appreciate that. I'll be in touch once my new life begins." He hung up, the small click of the phone ending another chapter. He sat in the quiet darkness of the caravan, waiting. The minutes stretched into hours. Around 1 o'clock a.m., the familiar crunch of gravel announced Carol's return. The caravan door creaked open, and she stumbled in, staggeringly drunk, her movements clumsy and loud. The very air around her seemed to reek of cheap wine and the indefinable scent of treason. She fumbled with the light switch, bathing the small space in a harsh, sudden glow. Her eyes, unfocused and glazed, settled on Frank. She swayed, a sloppy grin spreading across her face. "Frank, come here, I want you." Her words were slurred, inarticulate, barely distinguishable. Frank looked at her, truly looked at her. The last vestiges of love, of hope, shriveled and died within him. His jaw tightened, his teeth clenched so hard he could feel a dull ache in his temples. "No way in hell." His voice was low, laced with a venom he hadn't known he possessed. "Who knows what's been in there since tonight? Screw you." Carol, far too intoxicated, too lost in her own stupor, didn't perceive the seething mental state behind his quiet fury. She didn't hear the finality in his words, the irrevocable judgment that hung in the air. She just giggled, stumbled a few more steps, and collapsed fully clothed onto the bed, her body heavy. She passed out instantly, like a light extinguished, her breathing already deep and even. Frank watched her, unmoving, the cold resolve in his heart hardening into an impenetrable block. The final pieces of his decision clicked into place, precise and absolute. He would leave her, and he would not look back. The next morning, a dull throb began behind Carol's eyes, quickly escalating into a jackhammer assault against her skull. Her mouth felt like sand, her stomach churned violently, and the lingering taste of sour wine was a constant reminder of the previous night. A crippling hangover had taken root, tightening its icy grip around her. She squeaked weakly for Frank, her voice thin and reedy. No response. The caravan was silent, save for the thumping in her head. She forced herself to roll out of bed, the movement sending a fresh wave of nausea through her. She barely made it to the small, cramped bathroom before a violent bout of vomiting seized her, emptying the last remnants of her indulgence into the porcelain bowl. Gasping, her throat raw, she stumbled out, still no sound from Frank. Her head swam, and a strange sense of unease, beyond the physical misery, started to prickle at her. Still unable to get any response from Frank, she pushed open the caravan door, crawling on hands and knees into the fresh morning air. The sunlight, usually a welcome warmth, felt like 1,000 needles pricking her skin. She blinked, trying to clear her blurred vision. Frank was there, sitting serenely at the picnic table, bathed in the golden light of the new day. He was calmly eating breakfast, a paper cup of coffee, croissants from a bakery, and a small carton of orange juice. A neat, unremarkable meal, yet to Carol it looked like a feast of defiance. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable at first. Then, a slow, cruel smirk spread across his face, a mask she had never seen before. He looked at the unfortunate woman, now reduced to a pathetic, crawling figure. "Well, well, well, look what the cat brought," he sneered, his voice heavy with contempt. "You're not feeling very well, are you?" There was no sympathy, no concern, only a cold, calculated pleasure in her suffering. Carol tried desperately to speak, to offer some defense, some explanation, but her voice refused to obey, caught in her raw, constricted throat. Only a pathetic croak escaped her lips. Frank leaned forward, his voice hardening, each word a stone dropped onto her already fractured composure. "You'd better keep your filthy mouth shut and listen carefully." His eyes, usually mild, were now chips of ice. He reached into a plastic bag beside him and pulled out a stack of papers. The car title, the insurance, the registration. He placed them neatly on the table, then added the car key gleaming in the sun. Behind them he laid the caravan papers, the lease agreement, the owner's manual. A stark symbol of her newfound burden. All of it. Carol managed to find a sliver of her voice, thin and trembling, confusion battling with terror. "What? Why?" Frank almost shouted, his composure breaking just enough to reveal the raw, unadulterated fury beneath. "Shut your stinking mouth while I'm talking!" Carol recoiled, truly shocked. Frank had never spoken to her like that. Never, not once in their 22 years of marriage, had he ever yelled at her, much less used such brutal language. The unexpected force of his voice hit her harder than any physical blow. This was not the malleable, agreeable Frank she knew. This was something entirely new. Terrifying. "Bank cards are here, credit cards are all yours." Frank delivered the next calculated blow, his voice returning to its chilling calm. He pushed a stack of cards across the table. "I'm leaving." Despite her misery, despite the sudden, terrifying reality of his words, Carol managed to ask, a desperate plea in her voice. Are you coming back? We need to talk. Her mind, still clouded by alcohol and pain, couldn't quite grasp the full weight of his actions. An icy calm descended over Frank, colder than any Midwestern winter. He looked at her, his face devoid of emotion. That's the wrong question. His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth, any regret. The question should be, are you coming back? And the answer is no, I won't. This is goodbye. Listeners, stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. 860 words. With the chilling words, this is goodbye, hanging in the crisp morning air, Frank shouldered his small backpack. The straps dug into his shoulders, a welcome physical sensation against the cold, dead feeling in his chest. He turned slightly, ready to walk away forever, to leave this campsite, this life, this woman behind. Carol's carefully constructed world, her delusional game, shattered around her. No, this wasn't supposed to happen, she screamed, her voice hoarse from the hangover, laced with a raw panic. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted between Frank's resolute face and the caravan that suddenly felt like a prison. The truth in all its brutal clarity hit her like a physical blow. Her stomach churned again, a sudden, violent spasm. She felt another wave of nausea, on the verge of vomiting again. But this time it was from the emotional impact, not just the alcohol. Frank waited. He watched her, his face a mask of utter indifference. There was no compassion in his eyes, no flicker of the gentle, accommodating man she had known for over 2 decades. He was a stranger, a hard, unyielding figure she had conjured through her own recklessness. Finally, she managed to whisper, a desperate, raw plea. I love you. All I wanted was for you to be manly and stand up for yourself. I wanted you to be angry with me. The words tumbled out, a pathetic justification for her cruel manipulations. Frank looked at her then, a profound weariness settling over his features, mixed with utter disbelief. You succeeded perfectly, he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, but filled with a depth of rage that made it more chilling than any shout. I'm mad at you. I'm so angry. There are no words to describe it. His anger was not a fiery outburst, but a deep, pervasive coldness that permeated his very being. Then he dropped the ultimate bombshell, a cruel revelation delivered with surgical precision. You'd better check the sheets when I'm gone. His gaze flickered towards the caravan. They look exactly the same as they did when we were married. Stained. I don't think the stains will come out. He continued, his voice cutting through her hangover fog like a razor. And when you arrived yesterday, you smelled like a dilapidated brothel. He watched her face, pale and blotchy, as his words sank in. You think I didn't notice? You think I just forgot what happened in there last night? What happened outside with those men? He paused, letting the implications settle. My initial intention when I came back from my walk was to have a serious talk with you about our failing marriage, about your unhappiness and mine. But your behavior yesterday, in front of those strangers, it changed everything. His voice was flat, recounting facts, not emotions. Yesterday you made my decision very easy. You should get tested for STDs. I'm pretty sure you'll be found to have one of them. His last words crashed into Carol's consciousness with devastating clarity. The full horror of her actions, the grotesque irony of her plan, the irreversible consequences, all coalesced into a single, agonizing truth. The humiliation, the betrayal, the disease. It was too much. So, my dear, I'm leaving, Frank stated, his voice a final, resolute pronouncement. He echoed her own earlier demand for him to go, a bitter twist of the knife. He turned fully, adjusted his backpack once more, and began to walk. He didn't look back. He simply walked away from the campsite, towards the village, towards a new unknown life. Carol was left utterly shattered, physically and emotionally. She knelt on the gravel, the dust gritty against her raw knees, the cold reality of her solitude settling around her like a shroud. The gentle, malleable man she had sought to provoke was gone, replaced by a ghost of her own making, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her pride and the chilling consequences of her choices. Frank walked, the dust from the gravel road clinging to his shoes, the early morning sun climbing higher in the sky. Each step took him further from the campsite, further from Carol, further from the life he had known. A profound sadness settled over him, a dejection that was more encompassing than the raw anger from earlier. He felt hollowed out, utterly spent. Leaving was the easiest thing to do, he thought, the words a silent mantra in his head. What about now? What do I do now? And where do I go next? The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. In the early evening, after hours of walking and a short bus ride, Frank found himself in a small town a little north of Hallsberg. He located a modest boarding house, its painted sign weathered, offering the anonymity he craved. The room was small, sparse, with a single bed and a worn armchair. He closed the door, the click of the latch final, and stood in the center of the room. The enormity of the situation, the undeniable end of his marriage, finally crashed down on him. The careful composure he had maintained for days, for weeks, crumbled. A wave of dizziness swept over him, and he fainted, falling silently onto the faded rug. When he came to, the room was darker, the silence thick. A black cloud enveloped his thoughts. He grappled with the brutal fact that while he could handle Carol's abuse, the constant chipping away at his spirit, the public humiliation, adultery was a bridge too far. That betrayal, so carelessly, flagrantly displayed, had broken something fundamental within him. It was a line he could not, would not, cross back over. At the very same moment, miles away, in the cramped caravan, Carol woke again. Her headache, though still present, was less severe, but a horrifying taste, metallic and foul, lingered in her mouth. She carefully tried to get up, her limbs wobbly, but her stomach, for a fleeting moment, behaved better. Then the terrible stench hit her nostrils. It was the smell of stale vomit, of cheap wine, of something far worse and unspeakable. Her stomach lurched again. She ran outside, desperate for fresh air, for any escape from the putrid confines of the caravan. Just before the entrance, her foot squelched, and she looked down to see she had stepped in a dried puddle of her own vomit. The mess she had made, both literally and figuratively, was undeniable. Inside the foul-smelling caravan, breathing shallowly through her mouth, Carol began to move with a dawning dread. She gathered her toiletries, a clean towel, her toothbrush, and a fresh set of clothes. She needed a shower, needed to wash away the night, needed to scrub away the stench that clung to her. In the small, cramped shower stall of the campsite's communal block, the hot water beating down on her, she stripped off her clothes. As the steam rose, she saw them. Dark bruises blooming on her inner thighs, angry red hickeys mottling her neck and chest. And worse, far worse, was the lingering, abhorrent presence of stale semen still leaking from her. Her memories of the previous night were frustratingly sketchy, fragmented glimpses of unfamiliar faces, loud laughter, and too much wine. But what she saw now, reflected in the condensation on the shower door, was very bad news for her marriage. The horrifying realization dawned on her with a sickening clarity. Frank had indeed noticed her condition. He had seen the bruising, smelled the lingering evidence, and drawn his own conclusions. All of it. The gentle, forgiving nature of Frank, the deep, abiding love that had made him endure her abuse for so long, had finally been pushed past its breaking point. She understood, with a painful, sickening certainty, that her behavior in recent months, combined with the undeniable affair, had shattered any chance of saving her marriage. She stood in the shower, the hot water mixing with her tears, washing over her bruised body, cleansing nothing. She cried, deep, racking sobs, finally facing the painful, ugly truth of what she had done, the irreparable damage she had wrought. Meanwhile, miles away in his small, anonymous room, Frank, having cried his heart out earlier until no more tears would come, began to analyze his situation. The raw grief had subsided, leaving behind a cold, clear focus. He applied his problem-solving skills, honed over years of engineering, to the wreckage of his own life. The emotional storm had passed, and now he had to rebuild. Carol, physically ill and emotionally shattered, spent the rest of the day and most of the next packing up the caravan alone. Each item she handled, each pot and pan, each folded blanket, felt heavy with the weight of her choices. The drive home, usually a familiar comfort, became a long, difficult journey, stretching out endlessly across the flat Midwestern landscape. The car, once a symbol of family vacations, now felt like a lonely, mobile prison. She pulled into the driveway late in the evening, the house dark and silent. Sarah and Mike were waiting inside, their faces etched with a somber seriousness that aged them beyond their years. Frank had called them, explaining in simple, stark terms that he had left and why. They were fully aware of their parents' separation and the painful reasons behind it. Mike was the first to speak, his voice hard, devoid of the youthful deference he usually showed his mother. "So your plan worked, Mom," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You got him angry. You got him to stand up for himself. Just like I warned you, he snapped, and now look what you did." His support was now firmly, explicitly with Frank. The quiet boy who had feared his father's anger now understood its justice. Sarah, who had reluctantly agreed to support her mother up to a point, found it incredibly difficult to reconcile with her mother's actions in the depth of her betrayal. Her face was a landscape of disappointment and hurt. She didn't scream or yell, but her silence, the way she couldn't quite meet Carol's eyes, was a more profound judgment. News of the separation and hushed rumors of Carol's behavior at the campsite began to circulate quickly through their small Midwestern town. In places like this, gossip traveled faster than the wind across the cornfields. People looked at Carol with a mix of pity and thinly veiled condemnation. The carefully curated image of their perfect family was irrevocably fractured. Carol attempted to explain or justify her actions to her children, stumbling over her words, trying to frame her quest for variety as something noble, a yearning for Frank to be more. But her words rang hollow, devoid of genuine remorse in their ears. They saw only the wreckage, the self-inflicted wounds, and their father's quiet suffering. Miles away, Frank slowly settled into his new, solitary life in the modest boarding house. The quiet of the small room was a stark contrast to the constant emotional turbulence of his marriage. He spent his days quietly processing his profound grief, his deep-seated anger, and the trauma of betrayal. There were no demands, no criticisms, no manipulations, just the ticking of an old clock and the murmur of distant traffic. He began his extended vacation, using the time not for leisure but to heal, to reflect, and to meticulously plan for a future truly separate from Carol. He bought a new notebook filled with lists and calculations, practical steps towards rebuilding. Frank started to consider the necessary legal steps for divorce, pragmatically navigating the complexities of ending a 24-year marriage. The logistics of property, finances, and the children's welfare occupied his mind, providing a necessary distraction from the deeper emotional wounds. Carol, meanwhile, struggled deeply with her newfound independence. The house, once too small, now felt vast and empty. The crushing loneliness was a constant companion, and the pervasive shame she had brought upon herself was a weight that pressed down on her every waking moment. Her variety had brought her only isolation. The children navigated their fractured loyalties, caught in the devastating aftermath of their parents' shattered relationship. They went about their lives, but a shadow had fallen over their home, a chill that no amount of light could dispel. Frank, in his quiet room, found solace in new routines: a morning walk, a simple meal, a book from the local library. In the simple absence of constant conflict and emotional manipulation, a quiet strength began to emerge. He was wounded, but he was also free. Carol, alone in the house she had once deemed too predictable, finally realized the full, horrifying extent of the family unit she had irrevocably broken. Her selfish desire for variety, for some manufactured passion, had cost her everything. The heavy weight of her moral choices, her betrayal, and the profound loss of her family truly began to bear down on her. The silence of the house was not peaceful. It was deafening, filled with the echo of what she had destroyed. The divorce proceedings unfolded with a chilling efficiency that mirrored the end of their marriage. Frank remained firm, stoic, and emotionally detached throughout, a stark contrast to the bewildered husband Carol had once manipulated. His lawyers presented the facts, clear and irrefutable, leaving Carol's own legal team with little room to maneuver. He sought no vindication, only a clean break, a final severing of all ties. Carol struggled profoundly. Financially, the loss of Frank's stable income and her own lack of significant professional experience left her adrift. Emotionally, she was a wreck, having lost not only Frank's unwavering support, but also her own sense of self-worth. The woman who once prided herself on her perfect, predictable life now found herself staring at an empty calendar and a dwindling bank account. Her relationship with Sarah became permanently strained. Sarah tried, in her sensible way, to understand, but the depth of her mother's betrayal, the cold cruelty she had shown Frank, was a barrier too high to overcome. Mike, true to his word, maintained his resolute distance. He visited his father regularly, quietly helping him with small tasks, his loyalty unshakable. He simply could not forgive the pain inflicted on the man he admired, the quiet, gentle father he now saw as a victim. Carol faced increasing isolation from her former friends and community members. The bridge club dissolved, invitations to gatherings stopped arriving, and the once friendly waves from neighbors became stiff, averted glances. The quiet condemnation was palpable, a suffocating blanket woven from hushed rumors and unspoken judgments. Frank, ever the analyst, meticulously applied his skills to rebuild his life. He found deep satisfaction in his new work schedule, the challenge of different projects, and a newfound sense of personal freedom he hadn't realized he was missing. The small boarding house room was temporary. He found a modest apartment near his work, furnishing it simply, functionally, a place for him alone. He eventually sold the family home, the brick colonial with the neatly trimmed lawn that had once been the symbol of their life together. The sale severed the last physical ties and memories of his marriage with Carol, a final necessary cut. He moved the children's belongings into storage, ensuring they had access, but the house, with all its echoes, was gone. Years passed, slowly revealing the permanent, indelible scars left on the once close family. Sarah and Mike eventually built their own independent lives, pursuing careers, forming relationships. They maintained complex, often distant relationships with both parents, a constant negotiation of their fractured past. They loved their mother, but they could not erase what she had done, nor could they fully overlook her lingering bitterness. Carol's life was ultimately marked by profound regret and overwhelming loneliness that settled deep in her bones. The variety she had craved had turned into a desolate landscape of isolation. She eventually accepted that Frank would not return, that the man she had so carelessly broken would not mend himself for her. She understood finally that the true price of her reckless choices was her family, her dignity, and her community's respect. Gone, traded for a fleeting, desperate chase for something she couldn't even name. Frank, though forever scarred by the experience, found a measure of hard-won peace. He learned to trust again, cautiously, to open himself to new experiences. He understood that his quiet strength and resilience, once mistaken for malleability, were ultimately his greatest assets. He had endured immense suffering, but he had moved forward, painstakingly reclaiming his dignity and his shattered self-worth. He was not the same man, but in many ways he was a better one. The small Midwestern town continued its rhythms, the seasons turning, crops growing, lives unfolding. But the memory of the Frank and Carol's unraveling served as a quiet, enduring cautionary tale, a stark reminder that actions have consequences, that infidelity leaves deep wounds, and that sometimes the price paid is not just financial, but the irretrievable loss of love, family, and self. Carol lived out her days in quiet solitude, a poignant and tragic reminder of the pay the price theme, a lonely figure in a town that rarely forgot.